Hello and welcome to the news here on News Central. My name is Mazino Appeal. Now here are stories making headlines beyond the continent. The news begins with U.S. tariff controversies as President Donald Trump has announced a 90-day pause on tariffs effective immediately. Trump also said he would be raising tariffs on China to 125%, also effective immediately, citing the lack of respect that China has shown to the world's markets. This decision follows market turmoil triggered by the implementation of higher tariffs on 56 nations and the European Union, which went into effect just 13 hours earlier. Though the specifics of which nations will receive tariff relief remains unclear, those who do benefit will still face the baseline 10% tariff rate that took effect on Saturday, with China not included in the pause. In response to Trump's move, China escalated a trade war, raising duties on American products to 84% in retaliation. The European Commission also cited the U.S. tariffs as unjustified and damaging to both sides, as well as the global economy. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump's top trade official, Jamieson Greer, says a lot of countries are willing to negotiate, including Argentina, Vietnam, and Israel, who have offered to reduce their tariffs. Testifying before a U.S. House committee, the U.S. Trade Representatives also acknowledges that the adjustments to the spiraling trade war triggered by the U.S. salvo of tariffs may be challenging at times. U.S. President Donald Trump brushed off global market panic on Wednesday after China and the European Union announced retaliatory tariffs, telling Americans to stay cool despite his spiraling trade war.
Yesterday, I had a meeting with my counterparts from the EU, from Korea, from Ecuador, and Mexico, and that was after talking to the Senate for 4 hours in the morning. So there are a lot of countries who understand exactly what the problem is that the president has set out and are willing to talk to us and willing to negotiate. And so I think in the near term, there is an opportunity for these countries, if they want to have more reciprocal trade, to bring down their differential tariffs, bring down their non-tariff. Nearly 50 countries have approached me to discuss the president's new trade policy and explore how to achieve reciprocity. Several of these countries, such as Argentina, Vietnam, and Israel, have suggested they will reduce their tariffs and non-tariff barriers. These obviously are welcome moves.
So now to discuss more on this, we're joined by an author and senior humanitarian, Professor Mukesh Kapila. Mr. Kapila, you're welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Going to go straight ahead and ask, how might these tariffs exacerbate food insecurity or maybe even access to essential goods in vulnerable regions such as Africa, for instance?
It's too early to say, but there are bound to be direct and indirect consequences. The indirect consequences are obviously because anything that affects trade and makes agricultural inputs more costly, because Africa imports a lot of agricultural inputs, will raise the cost of food production, and that will obviously impact on food insecurity, as well as the other indirect effects, fuel and so on, which are also going to impact. Now, the direct consequences of tariffs on Africa, well, I'm not sure so much about that, because I believe that much of agriculture in Africa is exempt. More seriously is the effect, I think, on food insecurity because of reduction in humanitarian and food aid from the United States.
What about the consequences, especially for African countries that rely on imports from these countries, US, China, and also the EU? In light of the tariffs, what consequences do they face?
Well, they face consequences, mixed ones. So, for example, I think if importing the stuff from other countries gets more expensive, this should be a boost to domestic producers to up their production and find alternatives as well. It is also a boost for local retail and distribution. On the other hand, I think the problem is that we have a lot of internal barriers inside the African continent, and the external barriers are going to make internal barriers even worse, because African nations are probably not going to take a united approach, and they're probably going to kind of scrabble around and compete with each other in both in the global market and in the continental market, and that really is bad news for Africa.
And do you think this will affect migration pressures, especially when you look at Africa, where the economic opportunities are limited? How will this affect migration?
Again, I think stopping migration to rich countries, and the richer countries in Europe and Africa, in America, they have their own initiatives underway specifically on migration. And I think increasingly there's a hostile atmosphere to migrants in Europe and in the United States, which means that any thinking African, however poor he or she might be in Africa, would think twice about going out there. In any case, once they get there, I do not think that they're going to be economically very well off, because these trade sanctions are affecting rich countries as well. And so economic opportunities are also going to be dampened in the US and Europe.
Okay. So in what ways could the global trade tension impact humanitarian aid distribution, especially in conflict zones or maybe even crisis-affected areas?
I think it's going to affect it quite significantly, because, to be honest, the donor nations care less and less about aid, both development aid and humanitarian aid, as they divert resources either to defense or other objectives that their suffering economies are suffering. So humanitarian aid and food aid and so on are really much lower down the priority list. So I don't think, and growth is going to be slower in the donor countries anyway. So I think aid, which has been going down anyway, I think is probably the death blow to it, and Africans had better look out for themselves to mitigate their own suffering in the best way they can.
China is not taking these tariffs lying down. I mean, they're firing back for fire, fire for fire. Would you advise vulnerable countries, like maybe especially African ones, to also do the same? Or maybe not?
Well, if African governments, authorities took a leaf out of the Chinese playbook, they would be taking a very high risk. For once, the Chinese are more united, at least amongst themselves, and they're a strong government with a lot of aces up their sleeve. Poor African countries don't have very much. They are impoverished. They've got crises and conflicts going on, and they're fighting amongst themselves between countries, despite all sorts of platforms for common approaches and such like. So I think even if Africa emotionally wanted to fight back because it considers these sanctions to be unfair, it's not in a position to do that, and it would be a completely destructive approach for Africans to take on the US at this time.
Africa is not in a position to do that. Mr. Kapila, I want to say thank you very much once again this evening for joining us and elaborating on the dispute. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Now we're on a short break. When we come back, we've got more Beyond the Continent. Welcome back. Now, Iraq has signed a memorandum of understanding with U.S. energy firm GE Vernova to produce 34,000 megawatts of electricity during a visit by an American trade delegation. Iraq's Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani oversaw the signing of a memorandum of understanding as part of a strategic cooperation framework with GE Vernova. The signing comes at the conclusion of a visit to Iraq by a high-level U.S. delegation comprising of representatives from 60 private firms. Despite sitting on large reserves of petrol and natural gas, decades of conflict and instability have ravaged Iraq's energy infrastructure.
قدرة إنتاجية تصل إلى 24 جيجا واط إلى الشبكة الوطنية العراقية لتلبية الطلب المتزايد من الطاقة الكهربائية.
Britain and India meet on Wednesday to help secure a post-Brexit free trade deal as UK Finance Minister Rachel Reeves urged an acceleration of trade agreements worldwide amidst US tariffs. The UK has sought to bolster trade ties across the world since it left the European Union, and that need has only strengthened since US President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs have increased economic uncertainty. The UK and India are the 6th and 5th largest global economies, respectively, with a trade relationship worth £41 billion and investment supporting more than 600,000 jobs across both countries. In previous talks, India has pushed for more UK work and study visas for its citizens in exchange for lowering tariffs on British imports such as whiskey.
India is the first country that we ever held an economic and financial dialogue with the inaugural dialogue in 2007. And now, for the first time, this dialogue being led by two female finance ministers. And I think it is important now, more than ever, with everything going on in the world, that we continue as two countries with very close links to come together. And the economic consequences of increased geopolitical tension, climate change and disruption to trade flows will affect us all. And it's only by working together in partnership that we can navigate these challenges and work together to drive the domestic economic growth that we both need to see.
Together, we bring the strength of legacy and the energy of transformation, bridging tradition with technology and growth with sustainability. India and the United Kingdom represent pillars of resilience and innovation, shaping the global economic narrative in an era of transformation. Our collaboration demonstrates how democracies with diverse strengths.
Talking Russia-Ukraine war, Beijing has strongly rejected claims made by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, calling them absolutely groundless. Zelensky had told reporters on Tuesday that Ukrainian forces captured 2 Chinese nationals fighting alongside Russian troops in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. He further stated that there is evidence suggesting many more Chinese citizens are involved in ongoing conflicts. However, China, which has positioned itself as a neutral party in the war between Russia and Ukraine, quickly dismissed the accusations. The Chinese government insists there is no truth to these claims and maintains its stance of non-involvement in the conflict. In the meantime, Russia has condemned France, summoning its ambassador after a Russian foreign ministry employee was detained at a Paris airport while attempting to enter the country on official business. Tensions between the two countries have reached new heights as Moscow intensifies its criticism of France and President Emmanuel Macron for their support of Ukraine. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova claimed that French border police detained the official at Charles de Gaulle Airport on April 6, seizing her phone and computer, calling it a shameful spectacle. Zakharova emphasized that the Russian officials had a valid French visa and was traveling as part of an official delegation. Russia has issued a formal protest to Paris, and the detained employee was eventually allowed entry after nearly 7 hours, though the consular officer faced delays in gaining access to her.
Министерство. То, что произошло 6 апреля в аэропорту Шарль-де-Голь, вообще не подлежит никакому объяснению. Мы, безусловно, потребовали от французской стороны таких объяснений. Честно говоря, сложно представить, как они будут оправдываться. Французская пограничная служба без объяснения причин задержала сотрудницу Министерства иностранных дел России, члена российской официальной делегации, изъяв ее телефон и компьютер. Посольство России незамедлительно направило в аэропорт консульского работника. Нашему дипломату пришлось ожидать почти 7 часов доступа к...
Now, still in Europe, over 15,000 Greeks marched through Athens and other cities on Wednesday, joining the second general strike of the year to demand higher wages amidst rising living costs. Public sector unions, including transport workers and also air traffic controllers, participated, disrupting services like rail, ferry, and public transport. Schools, banks, and public offices were also shut down. Protesters voiced frustration with the government of Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, calling for salary increases to match inflation. Many blame high energy prices and the unchecked growth of tourism for rising costs, especially housing. While Greece saw economic growth of 2.2% last year, wages remain stagnant. The government recently raised the minimum wage but protests continue over inadequate economic relief for workers. Our tragedy has struck the Dominican Republic, where at least 124 people have been killed after the roof of a popular nightclub collapsed during a concert. Among the victims were music legend Ruby Perez and former Major League Basketball pitcher Octavio Dotel. News Central's international correspondent Avia Hagen has more.
A frantic search for survivors continues as rescue crews comb the debris of the Jet Set nightclub in Santo Domingo. The roof gave way during a packed concert headlined by beloved Dominican merengue singer Ruby Perez. Perez, who was performing when the roof collapsed, was amongst the confirmed dead. His manager said funeral arrangements are underway as fans across the country mourn the loss of a musical icon. Also killed was 51-year-old former MLB pitcher Octavio Dotel. He was pulled from the rubble alive, but died on the way to hospital. Tributes have poured in, including a moment of silence and an image tribute at Citi Field in New York. Local officials say between 500 and 1,000 people were inside the club when the roof collapsed. Families gathered outside hospitals, desperate for updates on loved ones. Aerial images show the massive damage, a gaping hole where the roof once stood. A crane and over 370 rescue personnel are working around the clock to recover bodies and search for any possible survivors. President Luis Abinader visited the site and declared 3 days of national mourning. The country's emergency operations director vowed that as long as there is hope for life, efforts will continue. Jet Set, considered one of the Dominican Republic's top nightclubs, has operated for more than 50 years. Its last social media post invited fans to enjoy the greatest hits of Ruby Perez just hours before the disaster. The tragedy comes at a time when the Dominican Republic is enjoying a tourist boom. Authorities are now urging the public to donate blood to help the injured. The cause of the roof collapse is still under investigation. For now, a nation grieves as it honours the lives lost in one of the worst recent tragedies. For News Central, I'm Afia Hagen.
Britain's King Charles III on Wednesday went on a state visit alongside Queen Camilla to Italy, where he addressed the country's parliamentary, Now, during his address, the monarch said the purpose of his state visit is to reaffirm the deep friendship between the two countries. The King's speech, the first by a UK monarch to a joint session of Italy's two legislative chambers, comes as he celebrates his 20th wedding anniversary with Camilla.
È molto importante per la regina e per me tornare in Italia per la nostra prima visita dopo l'incoronazione. Il momento è ancora più speciale per entrambi, dato che oggi ricorre anche il nostro 20° anniversario di matrimonio. So, I am here today, ladies and gentlemen, with one purpose: to reaffirm the deep friendship between the United Kingdom and Italy, and to pledge to do all in my power to strengthen that friendship even further in the time that is granted to me as king.
Now, Indonesia's President Prabowo Subianto has announced readiness to temporarily shelter Palestinians affected by the ongoing war in Gaza. Speaking before his departure for a Middle East tour, Prabowo said Indonesia is prepared to receive wounded victims and traumatized or orphaned children, estimated 1,000 evacuees in the first wave. He also stated that Indonesia is ready to send planes for evacuation and that the shelter will be temporary until recovery and safe return are possible. The president instructed the foreign minister to coordinate with Palestinian officials and regional partners on evacuation plans. Meanwhile, nearly 400,000 Gazans have been displaced since Israel resumed military operations last month. Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim-majority nation, has consistently supported a two-state solution and continues to back humanitarian efforts in the region.
Juga siap untuk menerima korban-korban yang luka-luka. Kami nanti segera akan mengirim Menteri Luar Negeri untuk diskusi dengan pemerintah Palestina, dengan pihak-pihak di daerah tersebut, bagaimana pelaksanaannya. Kami siap mengevakuasi mereka yang luka-luka, mereka yang kena trauma, anak-anak yatim piatu.
And that's all on Beyond the Continent this evening. Remember that you can send your eyewitness report to the WhatsApp number on your screens now. Do follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV, and you may watch us live on DSTV channel 422, GoTV channel 23, Star Times channel 274, Able TV, and of course on YouTube. Many thanks for watching. My name is Mazzino Appeal.